Hello class. In Chapter 12 we'll be discussing the private sector system and the impacts of privatization on the criminal justice system today. Privatization can be defined as altering the state of corrections from public to private control or ownership. Private sector provisions of services under contract to public agencies, including incarceration facilities. So when it comes to privatization, we're seeing a new movement here where private prisons are housing inmates for profit. And the privatization effort really has a lot of controversy due to the fact that there is profiteering going on based on the incarceration of inmates. With earlier privatization efforts, we've seen privatization of healthcare, food services, education, mental health, transportation, and training. One of the large controversies with privatization is the fact that state and federal governments have a very expensive bill when it comes to having to house inmates. So the promise of the private prison is that they can, one, do it better, and two, they can do it cheaper than the government can do it as far as providing the services, providing the care, providing everything that's needed to house the inmates. Unfortunately, that promise has really been unrealized. Typically, the costs of incarceration tend to be quite high, and one of the ways that the private prisons tend to get the number to a certain amount, dollar figure, is they cut services or they offer bare bones services. So there is a lot of controversy regarding whether or not, one, people should be profiteering off of the incarceration of inmates, since private prisons have a vested interest in not seeing people released from prison, and two, whether or not they can really live up to their promise that they can, in fact, operate the facility cheaper and do just as good of a job as state governments and federal government can as far as how they facilitate the operations of the institution. So it's difficult for the state to recruit and retain qualified healthcare staff. And the private sector, typically they tend to contract for these type of services, and the management and operation of healthcare services becomes the responsibility of the contractor. But in terms of who's ultimately responsible, you never really contract away your responsibility. So what happens is when state institutions, for example, attempt to bring in private vendors to be able to provide the care and the services, they're still ultimately responsible. It would be likened to if you had an apartment and you sublet your apartment, a room in your apartment, to someone, and they were to, unbeknownst to you, you're not home, and they decide they're going to punch holes in the wall. Well, the landlord is going to come to you and ultimately want you to pay for the damage, or it's going to come out of your security deposit because you're ultimately responsible for that apartment. You can't sign away your obligation to maintain that apartment because you signed a lease. So the same thing holds true with the state. They are ultimately responsible, and so when contractors come in and they don't do a good job, then sometimes they can leave the state holding the bag. There has been also privatization of prison healthcare services. The state ultimately must ensure that adequacy of those services and care to inmates to make sure it maintains a minimum level of standard. And the earliest involvement of the private sector, it really came from the pre-Civil War era with leasing out inmates. From 1870 to 1930, chain gangs were formed, and they were used for things like road construction, farming, and maintaining local community infrastructures. The level of correctional security facilities. The private sector provides institutions at a variety of different levels, ranging from minimum, medium, maximum. So when it comes to the level of correctional facilities, the private sector provides institutions at nearly every level, from community correction centers for juveniles and adults to maximum security facilities for adult felons. If you look at the statistics as far as what states house the largest number of private facilities and private facility inmates, you can see that Texas has a relatively high number of private facilities as compared with other states. Second to that would be Oklahoma, and third to that would be Tennessee. The growth of the private sector has been quite large. You can see it continues to escalate from the years 1992 through 2001. There were significant gains in the number of private sector facilities and private sector beds as far as how many inmates were housed within these facilities. As far as the rated capacity of private facilities, you can see that Texas has the largest number of inmates, as we stated, in the private sector, and they also have the highest number of capacity as far as bed space per facility. There are a lot of legal liabilities associated with contracting. We talked a little bit about contracting away rights and how the government can't totally do that. They still have an obligation to ensure the care, safety, and custody and control of the inmates. But monitoring is important, not to say that all private facilities are cutting corners and aren't providing a good quality of care, custody, and control, but to say that contract compliance monitoring is crucial to ensure that people are doing things the way that they're supposed to, that they're following state law, they're following federal law, that there are no egregious violations of contract compliance. So, amongst the criticisms of the private sector, oftentimes with the private sector, they require employees to underwrite their own training costs because employees don't have good benefits for the most part. They don't really have a lot of opportunities with the private sector because the way that the private sector is able to cut the cost is fringe benefits. So if they don't provide a lot of fringe benefits to their employees, they don't supplement their training, they don't pay for their equipment, they don't provide for other training costs, then that's how they can meet their bottom line as far as making the profit that they intend to make. Because at the end of the day, a private prison is being run like a business. And with all businesses, the intent is to make a profit. So in order to maximize their profit, they will sometimes pass on those costs to employees or otherwise reduce the amount of services that they offer. Monitoring of performance with the contracted service is oftentimes difficult, and why that is because I actually have been involved in auditing facilities. I've gone into a facility, and when you go into a facility and you look at the day-to-day operations, everything may look great, everything may be in compliance, but if you're not there every day, every hour, every minute of every day, you really don't know whether or not that service is being upheld consistently. And so what happens is oftentimes private contractors will have a facility, the state will come in, they will audit. Of course, they're usually told in advance when the audit would be, so they would make sure everything was up to snuff and the auditors came in and gave them the thumbs up and everything is good, but do they really maintain that quality of standard once the auditors leave? And that's really a variable outcome of having a private sector facility. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. So oversight is really important to maintain that minimum quality of care and minimum quality of staffing, and to make sure that everything is being provided in accordance with what the state requests and requires. They assume the role of the punishers, but only the state can punish, so that's another criticism because, again, it's a dual role. It's a conflict of interest, if you will, because the fact that these private institutions are not really interested in seeing people be released from prison, because by keeping people in prison, it tends to be more profitable for them. And because if you've ever worked in a job where the pay was low and the conditions maybe weren't exactly where you wanted them to be, oftentimes there's a lot of turnover in those jobs. So as people are constantly coming in and going out, you're losing a lot of experience. And so another criticism is that the staff are minimally qualified to do the jobs. So the private sector provides intent to make profit. So that's basically why they're there. They're not there to lose money. They're not there to see people get out of prison. They obviously have a vested interest in seeing all the beds in the prison full, making sure that they can maximize on the services of those inmates, the services that they offer, that they get paid for, the custody and control services that they get paid for. They want to make sure that they can maximize that profit. One of the ways that they can get to that number, that maximum profit number, is by charging inmates user fees for certain types of services. And an example would be medical services, where co-pays may be used. So if an offender has the ability to pay, they may make the offender pay a co-pay to access certain services, which in turn can increase profits and lower demands by inmates. So if people don't want to spend their own money and don't really have an interest in having to pay for their own health care, they may be less likely to file a frivolous complaint or frivolous type of request with staff stating that they want some type of service. So the private sector's responses to some of these criticisms, they say really that the true cost of corrections is vastly understated. There are a lot of factors that go into this. There are inmates that have significant health care concerns. It's expensive to run facilities, upkeep of those facilities, proper staffing, food, water, shelter, all those things cost money. And so when it comes to making a basic bid, if the facility says and the private sector says, we can do this for X amount of dollars, and we'll just throw a dollar amount out there, we'll just say $5 million. If the private sector entity says, well, we can run this operation for $5 million, and the state could run the operation as well, but maybe it'll cost the state $7 million in their projections. So it sounds pretty good on paper if you think, well, why would anyone take the risk of a private sector prison if they know that they oftentimes are riddled with controversy? Well, it comes down to money. And if you think you can save money, oftentimes states take that risk because they feel like, well, we may have to monitor it, we may have to make sure that it's functioning the way we intended to, but if it works correctly, yes, the private prison will benefit, but also we'll benefit because we'll save the state money. So with state correctional budgets, they're typically supplemented by other types of state units like payroll from the state treasurer, recruitment and employment from the State Office of Personnel, retirement benefits from the state public retirement systems, and private sector entities, they really don't have that supplemental type of funding. So one criticism that they fire back with is that they really aren't as supported by state monies, and they don't really have the infrastructure to provide for the benefits and the other types of perks that you would get if you were a state or a federal employee. They also say that unions and state corrections have forced upward the cost of corrections by bloating fringe benefits. I think we all can agree that we want to be paid well for what we do, for our knowledge, for our skills, our expertise. And so a lot of state and federal employees, they receive good benefits packages, and particularly if you're full-time. Services provided by a state are seldom evaluated for adequacy, and we can do the same or a better job at less cost. So this is what the private sector fires back with. But the reality is there's little consensus on the effectiveness of private sector providers of maximum security institutions. And if you look at the type of institutions that they tend to manage well, it tends to be more structured type of institutions. So if you look at inmate on inmate assault levels, they don't really get better or worse with the private sector. Inmate on staff assault levels, likewise. Minor disturbances, riots, and escapes. The level, if you look at some figures, they'll say, yeah, the private sector does it better. Some figures will say that the state and the federal government does it better. So really it just kind of comes out in the wash. There's really little consensus on or agreement on who can do a better job when it comes to the actual custody portion of operating a facility. If you look at training for staff, there's also a mixed picture on the effectiveness of this. Recruiting and training minorities and females, training academies for new hires, retaining higher quality staff over time. Mixed picture, we really can't say one is better than the other. Some private adult corrections companies have training facilities that equal those of the private sector, and others do not. So it's kind of a mixed bag. So in summary, Prison overcrowding has accelerated private sector involvement in corrections. We probably will be seeing more and more states that choose to try out at least at some level privatization with the intent of trying to save money. Many companies are now under contract to provide a range of services including maximum security. Private sector involvement remains controversial. The evidence on the support of effectiveness is sparse. So although we can show a lot of examples of where it didn't work, it's difficult for us to show really good examples of where it has worked. And I personally have had experience, like I said, seeing the case where it didn't work. And not to say that all privatization efforts are bad, just to say that there needs to be monitoring, compliance, oversight to ensure that the outcomes are consistent and to maintain the quality of care that is expected. So the state must carefully monitor compliance of providers on the number and quality of services to be provided. That concludes this presentation for Chapter 12. Please review this presentation and contact me if you have any questions. Have a great day. It was my pleasure working with all of you this semester, and I hope to work with you again in the future. Best of luck on your finals. Take care.